Hey, World History. Welcome to Unit 5. So, Unit 5 is a lot. We go through a lot of information in a really short period of time. So, like, for example, today we're going to talk about ancient Chinese basics. So, we're going from about 2000 BCE to 220 CE. But this unit really spans into more of like the Asian Middle Ages. And I think even when we talk about Japan real quick, it will be like we'll even factor in the United States into how Japan's history is affected by the United States, which is crazy to think that we're going from 2000 BCE all the way until, well, the US gets involved with Asian politics? Yeah, that's a long time. So let's get started. So students can describe the development of civilization in Eastern Asia. Today we're going to focus on China and analyze the emergence, development, and impact of philosophies of this era. So we're going to talk about Confucius. Your job, you're going to watch this ed puzzle, answer the questions. The questions I ask you in blue text today are just the ones I want you to answer on the ed puzzle. Make sure you're following along with your study guide. Anything in red text is going to be an important concept under study guide, so make sure you write it down. And of course, if you have questions, let your teacher know, okay? Either me or Mrs. Hinkle, we are here to help. All right, so prepare yourself. We're going to fly through about 2,220 years of history in about 30 minutes. So if we look here, this is your textbook. Yes, you have a textbook. I'm sure you're like, really? We have a textbook? Yeah. Some of the information that I put on the slides, or most of it actually, comes from your textbook. The reason why I don't have you read from the textbook is because, let's be honest here, most of you probably would not read from the textbook. So that's why I make these videos instead. So in your textbook, this is the section about Chinese history. So this is the first time your textbook focuses on Chinese history. According to your textbook, Chinese history started at 210 BCE. Do you think Chinese history only started in 210 BCE? No, it did not. It started many thousands of years before that. So, for example, I think we saw this map during Unit 1. Okay. And you can see here, this is where agriculture was created throughout the world. And as you can see here in China, okay, so like here's the US, okay, Pacific Ocean, here's China. Agriculture started about 12,500 to about 9,000 BCE. So humans were there during that time period, not in 210 BCE, many thousands of years before that. And here's also a map too that I believe we saw in Unit 1 about the spread of agriculture. So like in Africa, agriculture typically spread from north to south, south to north. Same thing with the Americas. But Eurasia, so Europe and Asia, are kind of a different case because agriculture actually spread more horizontally. Um, so a lot of agriculture was spread from China into like the Middle East and Europe, and also vice versa from Europe to China. So early China, 8,000 BCE, like I kind of said, like that 12,000, 9,000, 8,000, depends what historian you want to ask, was the first agriculture societies that formed in China. So China's land um, there's a lot of barriers from Western Asia and Europe to China. For example, in the West, there's the tall Tian and Takla mountains. So, as you probably could figure, mountains are pretty hard for people to cross. In the north, there's the Gobi Desert. Here's a picture of that right here. And of course, to the east, there's the gigantic Pacific Ocean. So China had like, it wasn't fully isolated, but it wasn't easy to get to due to terrain. So, early China. We have the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, which are the two major rivers in China. So this is where early agriculture began in these river valleys, and rice really thrived in these flooded fields from the river. So, herding animals started on the steppe lands of modern day Mongolia, which is in the north, so it's right up in here. If you don't know what the steppe lands are, they're typically elevated lands, but they're super flat. There's also subtropical forests in the southern part of China, um, which would be by modern day Vietnam and Laos. So that would be right down in here. So here is a terrain map of China. So more of like this yellowish, kind of reddish area. That means it's a really high elevation. So you can see like the mountains and the plateaus. And then over here in more the darker green is a lower elevation. So a lot more like waterways. And then here is a modern day population density of China. Okay. So the more of like the light yellow means like no one lives there. And the more of the red color means a lot of people live there. So here is my next question. What do you notice between the terrain of China and the modern population of China? So what you should notice is that a lot of the people who live in modern day China are going to live in these lower terrains with a lot more water. And towards the plateau, there's a lot less people because it's a lot harsher of a climate to live in, right? It's a lot colder. There's not as much vegetation nor water. All right, so here is the three eras that we're going to talk about today. We have the Shang period, which is from 1766 to 1045 BCE, the Zhou period from 1045 to 221 BCE, and the Han dynasty, which is from 221 BCE 20 CE. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is the Shang dynasty. So you can see here on the map, it's anywhere within these kind of the gray borders. So this kind of like little triangle shape, that would be the Shang dynasty's extent. All right, so like I said before, 1766 to 1045 BCE. It was the first large dynasty in Chinese history. The king who ruled over the dynasty was seen as a direct connection to their main god named Di. He was the king of divine rulers. They also really focused on having like a warrior culture, so there was a lot of warfare and hunting. They made conquered people, so those are like the soldiers and the civilians that would have lost the battles, into enslaved people. There was also the rise of bronze weapons and a lot of horse drawn chariots in battle, which I know we talked about a little bit with Egypt and with Rome as well. But wait, Miss Corey, horses. Horses. We talked about horses a little bit in the Greek unit and a bit in Unit 1, but where are horses from and how did they get domesticated? That's a great question, me. So here's kind of the short and sweet history about horses. So horses, they're the greatest animal companion to human history. You can ride them, you can pull carts and farm equipment with them. They're used in battle, used in art and social status, and yes, they're even eaten. So Paleolithic art of wild horses have been found in caves dating back to 30,000 BCE. So humans have been fascinated with them for tens of thousands of years. Domesticated horses started at about 3500 BCE in the Eurasian steppes. So that would be like modern day Mongolia. And it's used in ancient cultures such as China, Rome, Greece, Egypt, Assyria, and Persia. So horses were not originally ridden, but used to pull chariots. So here's my next question for you. What does someone need before a horse can be ridden? Two things, saddle and a stirrup. So saddles, like you see right here, they were invented by the Assyrians actually in about 700 BCE. They were not fancy saddles like we have today. They were typically just a thick piece of cloth or leather laid over the back of the horse. They were also used to sit more comfortably on the horse, and it had to use, but people still had to use their hands to steer and control the horse. Um, so, like, you could ride the horse, but you couldn't really do much else besides that. But along came the invention of the stirrup. So That is that thing that you see in this picture right here that dangles from the saddle, so humans can put their feet into the steer to steer the horse, and for helping them mount the horse. That was created by the Persians in 200 BCE, and it allowed a person to ride a horse with their hands empty. So, next question. If a person's hands are free while riding a horse, thanks to the saddle and stirrup, what do you think people, specifically soldiers, are going to start carrying in their hands while riding horses? Weapons! Yes, that's right, weapons. Okay? Swords, spears, later on, guns, other weapons. All right, I gotta stop. I'm getting ahead of myself here. So we're gonna talk about the Shang period still. Um, again, and the saddle wasn't invented during the Shang period because that was invented by Assyria. And then the stirrup was invented in Persia. So did the Shangs? Oh my gosh, so hard to say sometimes. So did the Shang soldiers even have saddles and stirrups? I'll answer that one for you, and the answer is no, they did not. So why did I even bring up the concept of saddles and stirrups and horses right now? That's a great question because they are such a huge part of history. And later on this unit, we are going to talk about Mongols, and horses are super duper uber important to the Mongols. Okay, let's get back to the Shang period. All right, so how do historians know about the Shang period? Great question. Their cities were very poorly preserved. So the Shang, if you remember the map, was kind of towards more the North China. It was kind of a harsher climate. Buildings were made out of wood, which means that they would decay away. And cities were surrounded by walls made of hardened dirt, which of course gets brittle and crumbles over time. So there's not a lot of like housing artifacts left from the Shang period. But the one thing that historians do get from the Shang period is found in graves. So paper is not invented in China until about 105 CE. So documents were typically etched into animal bones. There's also valuable objects in graves such as metals, bones, ivory, which is like tusks from or tooth or tusks from animals, shells, musical instruments, jewelry, and bronze weapons. Those all survived the Chinese climate. All right, next up, we're going to talk about the Zhou dynasty. And you can see it is in the kind of this blue color. So at first it's more this darker blue and then goes into a lighter blue color. So definitely bigger than the Shang dynasty. So it's pronounced the Zhou dynasty. Yeah, I know. So it was around from 1045 to 221 BCE. The Zhou overthrew the Shang dynasty in 1045 BCE. It was unknown where the Zhou were originally from. Like they came and conquered, but like where did they conquer from? Still a big historian mystery. But it is the longest dynasty in all of Chinese history. The first king, this is him down here. His name was Wu. And he overthrew the Zhou because they were not um, honoring gods and their ancestors properly. So King Wu created the Mandate of Heaven. Ooh, one of your vocab words. This is when the gods decided who was the king. If there was like a flood or a famine or any other kind of invasion or natural disasters, it was a sign from the gods that their king had failed and that a new one needed to take its place. Otherwise, if there wasn't like some serious famine or anything like that, the kingship was passed down through the family. But there was a really like important concept, like gods were the ones controlling the king. But in reality, it was just kind of luck of the draw if like a typhoon came or something. All right, so the most memorable person in the Zhou period is a philosopher named Confucius. Have you ever heard of Confucius or his teaching philosophy of Confucianism? Or if so, you can write it now. If you haven't, that's okay. Just say none or whatever. All right, so Confucius is actually his name in Latin. His Chinese name is Hongzi. And he lived sometime between 551 and 479 BCE. Depends what historian you ask when it comes to that. But he was an official and advisor to several Chinese Zhou rulers. He saw his current Zhou government officials as broken, and he made his philosophies based on the ideals of honoring gods and ancestors. Family members had their own duties in the family, and to guide people to be in harmony, specifically nonviolence, with each other. So we're going to watch a TED Ed video on him because the TED Ed video explains it a lot better than I ever could.
Most people recognize his name and know that he is famous for having said something. But considering the long lasting impact his teachings have had on the world, very few people know who Confucius really was, what he really said, and why. Amid the chaos of 6th century BCE China, where warring states fought endlessly among themselves for supremacy, and rulers were frequently assassinated, sometimes by their own relatives, Confucius exemplified benevolence and integrity, and through his teaching became one of China's greatest philosophers. Born to a nobleman but raised in poverty from a very young age following the untimely death of his father, Confucius developed what would become a lifelong sympathy for the suffering of the common people. Barely supporting his mother and disabled brother as a herder, an account keeper at a granary, and with other odd jobs, it was only with the help of a wealthy friend that Confucius was able to study at the Royal Archives, where his worldview would be formed. Though the ancient texts there were regarded by some as irrelevant relics of the past, Confucius was inspired by them. Through study and reflection, Confucius came to believe that human character is formed in the family and by education in ritual, literature, and history. A person cultivated in this way works to help others, guiding them by moral inspiration rather than brute force. To put his philosophy into practice, Confucius became an advisor to the ruler of his home state of Lu. But after another state sent Lu's ruler a troop of dancing girls as a present, and the ruler ignored his duties while enjoying the girls in private, Confucius resigned in disgust. He then spent the next few years traveling from state to state, trying to find a worthy ruler to serve, while holding fast to his principles. It wasn't easy. In accordance with his philosophy, and contrary to the practice of the time, Confucius dissuaded rulers from relying on harsh punishments and military power to govern their lands, because he believed that a good ruler inspires others to spontaneously follow him by virtue of his ethical charisma. Confucius also believed that because the love and respect we learn in the family are fundamental to all other virtues, personal duties to family sometimes supersede obligations to the state. So when one duke bragged that his subjects were so upright that a son testified against his own father when his father stole a sheep, Confucius informed the duke that genuinely upright fathers and sons protected one another. During his travels, Confucius almost starved. He was briefly imprisoned, and his life was threatened at several points. But he was not bitter. Confucius had faith that heaven had a plan for the world, and he taught that a virtuous person could always find joy in learning and music. Failing to find the ruler he sought, Confucius returned to Lu and became a teacher and philosopher so influential that he helped shape Chinese culture, and we recognize his name worldwide, even today. For the disciples of Confucius, he was the living embodiment of a sage who leads others through his virtue, and they recorded his sayings, which eventually were edited into a book we know in English as the Analects. Today, millions of people worldwide adhere to the principles of Confucianism, and though the precise meaning of his words has been debated for millennia, when asked to summarize his teachings in a single phrase, Confucius himself said, Do not inflict upon others that which you yourself would not want. 2,500 years later, it's still sage advice.
All right, so next up, we're going to talk about the Han Dynasty, which was from 221 BCE to 220 CE. So, beforehand, China was broken up into the Zhou dynasty and also several warring states. If you don't know what a warring state is, they're typically like smaller little kingdoms that are constantly fighting each other for power. Um, and the ruler of the region, um, Qin, and he who was part of the Zhou dynasty, and Shi Huangdi, who conquered the warring states and Zhou. And they expanded its territory to cover most of what we call modern day China. So as you can see here, there was like little triangle of blue right here. Now look at that. Huge. Look at that dynasty. Goes all the way into the mountains. You have all of this coastline going into what like modern day Vietnam is, up here through Korea. Really expanded. So there's a lot to talk about with the Han Dynasty. So we're just going to focus on the Han Dynasty as a society. So in 2 CE, the Chinese government census had about 60 million people living in the Han Dynasty, which is crazy to think because what, like the United States has like what? Um, um, but remember, this was back in like CE, and they had 60 million people. That's really impressive. So multiple generations would live under the same house. The eldest male was the head of the family, and a lot of the family centered upon respecting elders, ancestors, and of course, the gods. Women in the Han Dynasty did not have a lot of freedom. Women who were wives or moms to emperors, or to other high-ranking officials had influence through the males, but other than that, women were subjugated to males. Parents would choose who a woman married. The bride would go live with her husband's family. And the really unfortunate part is the bride had to prove to her mother in law that she was worthy to marry her soon to be husband. So the bride competed with the mom in law for attention and influence of what would be the bride's husband or the mother in law's son. So there was a lot of female rivalry just within families. To kind of sum it up too of the women's role, here's a quote about the traditional beliefs about conduct appropriate for women are preserved in a biography of the mother of a Confucian philosopher. So it says, a woman's duties are to cook the 5 grains, heat the wine, look after her parents in law, make clothes, and that is all. She has no ambition to manage affairs outside the house. She must follow the 3 submissions. When she is young, she must submit to her parents. After her marriage, she must submit to her husband. And when she is widowed, she must submit to her son. Yeah, so women did not have freedom in Asia. Okay, here's also another screenshot of your textbook. This is just a really good like hierarchy of the Chinese society. So on the very top is the emperor, but of course the emperor didn't really have that much power. Like he did, but he didn't. He was a lot more like a figurehead, okay? Because he was like the gods chose him, right? So he had a lot more like religious things to do versus political power. Usually his court was really the one that like ran the government. Below that you have kings and governors, so that would be part of like the emperor's court. And then below them, you have state officials and the nobles and scholars. And then this is kind of interesting. You don't see this a lot in Western society, but the peasants were actually above the artisans and merchants. It is because the peasants were believed um, to be more important because they're the ones growing the food. So that's why they're higher up than the artisans and merchants. And then the soldiers are towards the bottom. And of course, the enslaved population is on the very bottom. All right, there's a lot of really cool Chinese inventions during this time too. So we have gunpowder, Chinese compass, porcelain pottery, ancient Chinese mathematics and the abacus, silk, the search for elixir of life, the Grand Canal, Three Gorges Dam, Terracotta Army, Great Wall, traditional Chinese healthcare and medicine, Forbidden City, movable type, foot binding, paper money, Chinese writing. There's just so many really cool technologies that came out of this time period. And you will be researching them for your summative this time around. Um, and that will start next week. And I'll give a lot more instructions on how to do that. All right, so let's wrap this up. Today we talked about Chinese geography, the Shang period, like horses, saddles, and stirrups, the Zhou period, which is Confucius, and the Han Dynasty, which is the Chinese society. Next up, you're going to do U5-L3, Mongols and Ming. You're going to watch the Ed puzzle, fill out the study guide like normal. Questions, let us know. If you want to learn more, you can email me. My office hours are Mondays from 12 to 1. Mrs. Hinkle's are Wednesday. And of course, if you're in my class, I love to read your weekly check ins. All right, that's all I got. Thanks for watching. Bye.